My name is Camille Rowan. I am 33 years old, and 9 days ago I signed documents that may destroy the only legacy my father ever cared about. He still does not know how bad it is. Right now, at this exact moment, he is probably sitting in the leather chair in his den, loosening his tie after dinner, believing he survived the fallout. Believing the worst part was the shouting. Believing time will smooth things over the way it always has. But time is not going to fix this one. Because the envelope arriving at his office tomorrow morning is not emotional, it is not symbolic. It is not the kind of wound that heals after a few awkward holidays and a forced apology over turkey. It is legal. And contracts do not care about regret. My father's name is Warren Rowan. For 32 years, everyone in Mercer County knew him as the man who built houses faster than anyone else in the state. Rowan Custom Homes started with a single pickup truck, 2 ladders, and my grandfather's garage. By the time I was old enough to drive, the company had 30 employees, 7 crews, and Warren's name printed across white trucks parked all over the county. People respected him, feared him a little too. He had the kind of voice that made waiters stand straighter and subcontractors stop talking when he entered a room. Growing up, I thought that voice could hold entire buildings upright. I remember smiling because I thought he was about to explain engineering. Instead, he rested his hand on my shoulder and said, "That's going to be you someday, Cammy." For years, I carried those words around like scripture. Back then, it was just me, my father, and my grandfather Leonard Rowan. My mother died when I was 8, breast cancer. Fast and brutal. One year she was helping me practice spelling words at the kitchen table, and the next year I was watching adults speak in lowered voices around casseroles nobody ate. After she died, my father changed in ways I could not understand yet. He became quieter at home and louder everywhere else. He buried himself inside work. Leonard stepped in to raise me whenever Warren disappeared into 12-hour days and weekend job sites. My grandfather became my real constant. Leonard smelled like cedarwood and black coffee. He wore old flannel shirts even in summer and kept peppermint candies in his coat pockets. Every Sunday after church, he would sit with me in his office above the Rowan Custom Homes warehouse and let me organize invoices while he balanced ledgers. "Businesses are like families," he once told me while adjusting his reading glasses. "People think the loudest person is holding everything together. Usually it's the quiet one." I did not understand what he meant then. I do now. Warren met Celeste Harper the summer before I left for college. She worked at a boutique furniture store downtown and had a daughter named Brielle who was 10 years old at the time. Celeste was polished in a way my mother never tried to be. Perfect hair, perfect nails, soft voice. The kind of woman who remembered birthdays and knew how to decorate tables for holidays, so they looked like magazine covers. Inside those borders were Warren, Brielle, and eventually the version of the family she wanted to present to the world. Outside those borders was me, not openly, not cruelly. That would have been easier. Instead, it happened slowly enough that every single moment sounded petty if spoken out loud. "Cammy, sweetheart, Brielle really needs a creative space. Would you mind moving some of your boxes from your old bedroom?" 3 months later, my room became Brielle's art studio. My college trophies disappeared into attic storage. The framed photo of my parents dancing at their wedding vanished from the hallway. In its place appeared a professionally framed portrait of Warren, Celeste, and Brielle at a vineyard wearing matching cream sweaters. I was not in the picture because nobody told me it was happening. The first time I realized I was being edited out of my own family was Thanksgiving break during sophomore year. I walked into the house carrying laundry and overnight bags and saw the portrait above the fireplace. I stood there staring at it long enough for Celeste to notice. "Oh," she said lightly. "We meant to tell you about Family Photo Day. It happened kind of last minute. Family Photo Day, not Rowan Family Photo Day." Not everyone photo day, just family. I remember smiling because I did not yet know how to stop pretending things did not hurt. I wanted to become an architect. Not because of money. Not because of prestige, because of beams. Because of structures. Because somewhere inside me still lived the little girl standing on plywood while her father explained what keeps things from collapsing. When I told Warren I had been accepted into the architecture program at North Carolina State, he nodded distractedly while checking emails on his phone. "That's expensive," he said. I laughed nervously. "Yeah, but I got partial scholarships." Celeste set down her wine glass. "Knew you'd figure it out," he said. Then Celeste reminded him they had dinner reservations. They left before I even reached the parking lot. The distance grew quietly after that. Phone calls shortened. Holidays became logistical problems. Every invitation felt accidental. Every absence felt intentional. Sometimes I would call Warren on Sunday afternoons and hear Celeste in the background reminding him they were late for something. Sometimes Brielle answered the phone and sounded confused I was calling at all. "Oh, Dad's busy." Busy became permanent. Then Leonard died. Massive heart attack at 78. Found slumped over his office desk with half-finished paperwork beside his coffee mug. At the funeral, more than 200 people showed up. Contractors, suppliers, former employees. Entire families who lived in homes Leonard helped build decades earlier. Celeste complained about seating arrangements before the service began. "I just think immediate family should be together in the front pew." Immediate family, again. My Aunt Evelyn pulled me beside her before I had to ask where I belonged. After the burial, Leonard's attorney approached me in the church parking lot. His name was Theodore Gaines. Quiet man, expensive shoes, calm eyes. "Your grandfather left instructions for you," he said. We met in his office 2 days later. I still remember the exact wording because I have replayed it in my head hundreds of times since. Any voluntary relinquishment of shares by a member requires immediate buyout at independently appraised market value within 90 calendar days. Failure to satisfy buyout terms results in automatic operational receivership pending court restructuring. I blinked at him. "What does that actually mean?" "It means," Theodore said carefully, "your grandfather anticipated the possibility of one family member attempting to force another out emotionally while retaining financial control." I stared at the page. "And if the company can't afford the buyout, the court appoints outside oversight. Your father would lose operational control." I remember laughing softly because it sounded absurd. Like something from a television drama. I would never do that to him. Theodore closed the folder slowly. "Leonard hoped you'd never need to. For 2 years I tried. God, I tried." I emailed Warren requesting quarterly meetings regarding company operations. No response. I mailed formal notices asking for financial summaries as minority owner. Ignored. I invited him to lunch repeatedly. Cancelled. Forgotten. Postponed. Once he arrived 25 minutes late. Spent 11 minutes texting during the meal, then left early because Brielle needed help shopping for sorority decorations. I kept telling myself it would improve eventually. That if I stayed patient enough, useful enough, quiet enough, he would remember I was still his daughter. Then came the Father's Day dinner. The text arrived on a Tuesday evening. Father's Day dinner Sunday, entire family. Be there. Dad, I stared at it for a long time because Warren almost never texted me directly anymore. Usually communication came through Celeste. I called Aunt Evelyn immediately. She sighed before I even finished asking. "Something's planned," she said. "Celeste has been organizing this for weeks. Caterers, decorations, photographer." A photographer? That's what worried me too. Something settled heavily in my stomach after that conversation. Not certainty, not proof, just instinct. The kind engineers learn to trust when a structure feels wrong before visible cracks appear. The next morning I called Theodore. If I ever needed to activate clause 8.4, I asked carefully, how quickly could paperwork be prepared? Silence. Then quietly, within 24 hours. I'm not saying I'll sign anything. I understand. But I think he already knew. Thursday afternoon, I drove to Theodore's office downtown. The folder was already waiting on his desk. Blue cover. My name typed neatly across the tab. Inside were 3 documents: voluntary relinquishment of ownership, formal appraisal request, mandatory buyout notification. Theodore slid them toward me but kept one hand resting lightly on top. You do not need to decide today, he said. I appreciated that he did not use sympathy in his voice. Sympathy would have broken something in me right then. I just want them ready, I said. He nodded once. Understood. I left without signing. That evening, I made pasta in my condo kitchen and ate alone while rain tapped softly against the windows. The television played some renovation show I was not watching. A smiling couple argued about countertops while my untouched wine turned warm beside me. I kept replaying the phrase from Leonard's letter. Never surrender your seat at the table. At midnight, I opened my laptop and stared at old photos for almost 2 hours. Pictures from before Celeste. Before Brielle. Before every room in the house started feeling curated instead of lived in. There was one photo of me sitting on Warren's shoulders at a county fair when I was 6. Another of Leonard teaching me how to use a measuring tape. One blurry Christmas morning where my mother was laughing at something outside the frame. Back then, I looked included naturally. Nobody had to make space for me. Friday morning, Aunt Evelyn called asking if I could help set up for Sunday's dinner. Celeste wants extra hands, she said carefully. I almost said no, but some stubborn part of me still needed proof. Proof I was imagining things, proof my instincts were wrong. So I drove to the house on Maple Ridge Drive just after noon. The place looked like it was preparing for a magazine shoot. Fresh flowers everywhere. Gold ribbon tied around candle holders. Rental chairs stacked near the garage. Moved coolers. No one asked how I was doing. No one asked about work. At some point, I wandered into the dining room and froze. 26 place cards were arranged around the massive table. I found mine eventually, very end of the table. Between second cousin Trevor and an empty seat near the wall. Warren's chair sat at the head, Brielle directly beside him. Celeste opposite her. A photographer's lighting setup stood folded near the fireplace. I stared at my place card longer than necessary. Need help with something? I turned. Aunt Evelyn stood in the doorway holding napkins. No, I said softly. I found my seat. Something flickered across her face. Pity maybe. Or guilt. Before she could answer, laughter echoed from the kitchen. I walked toward it automatically and stopped cold halfway down the hallway. On the kitchen island sat an ornate gold frame. Inside was a cream-colored document with elegant calligraphy. Certificate of Adult Adoption. State of North Carolina. I set down the stack of napkins still in my hands and walked out through the side door without saying goodbye to anyone. The drive home took 48 minutes. I remember because I watched the clock the entire way while gripping the steering wheel so hard my hands cramped. Saturday morning, I went to Aunt Evelyn's house. She lived 4 blocks away in a pale yellow ranch-style home that smelled permanently like cinnamon and coffee. She opened the door before I knocked twice. You saw it, she said immediately. Not a question. I nodded. We sat at her kitchen table while rain tapped gently against the windows. After several minutes, she disappeared into the hallway and returned holding a framed photograph. Professional studio portrait. Warren, Celeste, Brielle. Matching navy outfits. Perfect smiles. No space left for anyone else. When was this taken? I asked quietly. March. I stared at the photo. 3 people arranged like a complete equation. No missing piece. It's becoming official Sunday, she said brightly. Dad's legally adopting me. Someone congratulated her. Then Brielle laughed and added, honestly, Camille was never really part of this family anyway. The sentence hit so cleanly it almost didn't register at first. I stopped walking. Brielle noticed me immediately. And the thing I will never forget is this. She did not look embarrassed. She looked annoyed at being overheard. That's harsh, Cousin Nolan muttered. Brielle shrugged casually. Once filed Monday morning, he said quietly. The 90-day buyout window begins. How much? Current estimates place your 40% between $350,000 and $370,000. I stared at him. That was what 14 years cost apparently. $360,000 in 90 days. And if they can't pay? The court assumes operational oversight. I looked out his office window at people crossing the street below. Normal lives. Normal afternoons. Meanwhile, mine felt like standing beside demolition charges after already pressing the button. You can still stop this, Theodore said gently. I nodded again. But even then I knew I wouldn't. Sunday morning I woke before sunrise. For a while I just lay there staring at the ceiling. The withdrawal window remained open until 2:11 p.m. One phone call could erase everything. One moment of weakness, one hopeful instinct. I showered slowly. Chose a dark blue dress because Leonard loved navy blue ties. Wore my mother's sapphire earrings Aunt Evelyn had saved for me after the funeral years earlier. At 4:30, I stood in my bedroom holding my phone. Theodore's number glowed on the screen under recent calls. I could still stop it. If Warren looked at me that night the way he used to. If he acknowledged me once sincerely. If he remembered I was his daughter before I was an inconvenience, that was all it would take. One genuine moment. Neither of us spoke. At 7:18, Warren tapped his wine glass with a fork. The room quieted instantly. Celeste dimmed the overhead lights dramatically. Candles flickered across polished silverware. The photographer lifted her camera into position beside the fireplace. Only then did I notice the adoption certificate displayed on a wooden easel behind Warren's chair, gold frame. Cream paper, waiting. Everything inside me went still. Everyone, Celeste announced warmly. Warren has something very special he'd like to share tonight. Warren straightened his tie, lifted his glass, and smiled the smile people use before delivering rehearsed emotion. Family means everything to me, he began. I folded my hands carefully in my lap and listened while my father erased me in front of 26 witnesses. Warren's voice filled the dining room like he had practiced every syllable in front of a mirror. Family, he repeated, slower this time, is not just about blood. It is about who stands beside you when life becomes difficult. Celeste nodded on cue, eyes glistening in the candlelight as if emotion itself had been scheduled. Brielle sat perfectly still, hands folded, already anticipating her moment. Warren continued. And I have been given a second chance in life to build something I thought I lost forever. A faint smile pulled at his mouth. I want to recognize the person who brought joy back into my home, who gave me purpose again, who reminded me what it feels like to be a father. He paused, just long enough for the room to lean forward emotionally. Then he turned slightly toward Brielle. My daughter, he said. The word landed cleanly, deliberately. Brielle inhaled sharply like she had been holding her breath for this exact moment her entire life. Celeste touched her chest. Somewhere behind me, someone whispered, "Oh my God." Warren stepped forward and picked up the gold-framed certificate from the easel. The photographer raised her camera. Flashlight reflections danced across polished silverware. I am proud, Warren continued, voice steady now, to officially adopt Brielle Harper as my daughter. Applause erupted immediately. Clapping, cheers. Someone stood up. Then another. The sound filled the house like celebration had been compressed for years and finally released all at once. There is a specific kind of silence that comes when a structure is about to fail but has not yet made the sound. That was me. Warren raised his glass again while still holding Brielle with the other arm. I finally have the daughter I always deserved, he said. The room erupted again. This time louder, longer, more certain. And just like that, I disappeared completely inside my own father's sentence. No hesitation, no accidental mention. No leftover space. I became nothing more than negative room in a story someone else was telling. My hands remained folded. My breathing remained even. My pulse, however, was not. It was very precise. Very controlled. Very aware. Aunt Evelyn leaned slightly toward me. Camille, she whispered carefully. Don't do anything you'll regret. I didn't look at her. I'm not, I said softly. And I meant it, because what I was about to do was not emotional. It was procedural. Through the hallway. Past framed family photos. Past decorations that had been carefully chosen to represent unity. I reached Warren's office door. It was slightly open. Inside, the room was dimmer, quieter, untouched by celebration. The desk still carried the faint scent of his cologne and leather-bound folders. And there it was. The operating reality of everything they had just celebrated. Stacks of contracts, project bids, financial binders. And beneath it all, the structure that held the entire company together without anyone in that dining room realizing it could even be pulled apart. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, not locked, just closed. The sound of celebration muffled instantly, like someone had lowered the volume on a world I was no longer participating in. I walked to the desk, opened the top drawer, pulled out a manila folder I had placed there days earlier. Theodore's name was stamped on the tab. I took out my phone. 3 unread screenshots still sat in my gallery, the group chat. My father, Celeste, Brielle, reclassify her shares as dormant, change the locks. She won't even notice. I looked at those words again. Then I placed the phone face down on the desk, and I waited, not long. Because consequences, when properly structured, do not require patience. They only require activation. From the hallway outside, laughter surged again. A toast beginning. Another round of applause. Then, a new sound. A ringtone. Warren's phone. Vibration echoing somewhere in the dining room. He ignored it at first. The celebration continued. But the phone kept ringing. Persistent, professional, unavoidable. Then another phone rang, and another. The tone was different this time, not personal, not casual, official. A shift occurred in the atmosphere outside the office door, like air pressure changing before a storm breaks. The laughter faded slightly, confusion replacing certainty. What is a receivership notice? That word cut through the house differently. It was not part of celebration language. It did not belong on balloons or banners or framed certificates. Footsteps approached the hallway. Fast. Confused. Warren appeared in the doorway seconds later holding his phone. His face was no longer red with pride. It was pale, not angry yet. Not understanding yet. Just unsettled. That's not possible, she whispered. Brielle stood in the hallway behind them, still holding a wine glass someone had given her during the toast. Her eyes moved between their faces. What is happening? She asked. No one answered her. Warren looked at me now. Really looked. For the first time all evening. What did you do? He said. And there it was, not understanding. Not grief. Not apology, recognition. I stood up from the desk slowly, calmly. No, this is not. This is not real estate law, this is family business. It is both, I said. Silence. The dining room laughter was gone now, completely gone. Even from here I could feel the shift. People moving, chairs scraping. Confusion spreading through walls. Warren finally looked up again. His voice dropped. How much? I didn't hesitate. $360,000. Celeste let out a sharp breath. That's insane. It's contractual, I replied. Relief too early. Then let's fix this. We are family, I repeated, which is why I didn't do this impulsively. Warren stared at me. Understanding finally beginning to surface behind his eyes, slow, unwanted. He spoke quietly now. You planned this. I nodded once. Yes. The room outside was fully silent now. No music, no celebration. Only people realizing something had ended that they did not know could end. Warren took a step toward me. His voice cracked slightly. Brielle stepped back into the hallway, suddenly unsure where she belonged in a conversation she thought she had already won. From the dining room, I heard someone ask in a low voice, "Is the company closing?" Warren turned slightly toward the sound, then back to me. His voice was lower now. What do you want? And that question finally was honest. I exhaled slowly. Not satisfaction, not anger, just resolution. I want nothing, I said. A pause, then I added, I already made my decision. For a moment no one spoke. The house, which had spent the evening celebrating a new daughter, now stood frozen in the aftermath of a completely different kind of announcement. One no one had rehearsed for. I picked up my phone from the desk, unlocked it, checked the time. Then I looked at Warren one last time. You have 90 days, I said, and I walked past him. Out of the office. Through the hallway. Back toward the front door, where the sound of a collapsed celebration was just beginning to fully register. No applause followed me this time. Only silence. And for the first time that night, I did not feel like I was standing outside the family. I felt like I had finally stepped out of something that was never structurally sound to begin with. Warren did not follow me immediately. That was the first sign he still thought this could be argued. Arguments only happen when someone believes the structure is negotiable. I stepped into the hallway and felt the house in a completely different way now, not as a home. Not as a family space, as an asset under stress. Voices were starting again in fragments behind me, confusion replacing celebration. What is receivership? Did she say 300,000? This has to be a misunderstanding. Then Celeste's voice, sharper now, cutting through the uncertainty. She cannot do this. Warren, tell them she cannot do this. But Warren didn't answer her right away. Because for the first time he was reading. Actually reading. Not a skimming. Not assuming, not delegating. I walked past the dining room doorway. Every head turned slightly as I passed, but no one spoke to me. That silence had changed shape. It was no longer exclusion. It was recognition. The kind that comes after impact. Aunt Evelyn stood up slowly from her chair. She didn't look at anyone else. Only at me. Camille, she said quietly. I stopped just long enough to meet her eyes. I'm okay, I said. It wasn't a reassurance. It was a statement of fact. Behind her, someone whispered my name like it had weight again. Not invisible anymore. Just dangerous. I kept walking. Warren's footsteps finally followed, faster now. He caught up at the front hallway near the entryway where the light from the porch spilled inside. Stop, he said, not loud. Not commanding, just strained. I stopped, turned. And now you're using it against your own family. That word again. Family. I looked past him for a second, through the open doorway into the dining room. Celeste was standing now. Brielle was still in the hallway behind her. The guests were no longer celebrating anything. They were listening. Waiting for resolution that wouldn't come cleanly, I turned back to Warren. You stood in that room, I said calmly, and told 26 people you finally had the daughter you always deserved. His expression tightened. I didn't mean. You meant it enough to say it in front of me. Silence. Not denial this time, just impact settling, I continued. You erased me from that table before I even stood up. That's not true. It is, I said. And you've been doing it for years. Just slower. Celeste stepped into the hallway now, her voice controlled again, trying to regain footing. This is emotional, she said carefully. We can fix emotional things. I turned slightly toward her. To do what? To decide what kind of ending this is going to be. That was the last thing I said before turning toward the door. I stepped outside into the night air. It was cooler than I expected. The kind of quiet that exists after something irreversible has been acknowledged. For a few seconds, I just stood there on the porch, listening. Inside the house, voices began overlapping again. Raised tones, questions, Warren calling for someone to bring him the documents again. Celeste insisting there must be a legal mistake. Brielle crying now, quietly. Not the celebratory kind of crying from earlier. Something else. Something less certain. I didn't move. Because this part was important too, not for them, for me. When Warren finally came to the door again, he didn't step outside. He just stood in the doorway, framed by warm light and unfinished consequences. His voice was lower now, controlled again. Negotiating tone. The issue was what remained standing after everything stopped. I reached my car, opened the door, sat inside. And for the first time all night I exhaled fully, not relief, not victory. Just release of tension that had been held too long. Inside the house, I could still see movement through the windows. But it no longer felt like mine to interpret. I started the engine. As I pulled out of the driveway, the house stayed lit behind me. Still standing. But no longer stable in the way they thought it was. And somewhere between leaving and disappearing from view, I realized something very simple. They had spent years deciding where I belonged. But they had never once considered what would happen if I decided to stop belonging at all. And now they were about to find out. The first thing Warren did after I left the driveway was not call me again. He called his attorney. Then he called his bank. Then he called the company controller. And only after all of that did he finally understand what Theodore had already told him in a single sentence buried inside legal language that now felt like a trap snapping shut in slow motion. The 90-day clock was not a suggestion. It was a countdown. By Monday morning, Rowan Custom Homes was no longer operating in the comfortable illusion of normalcy it had enjoyed for decades. The receptionist at the front desk noticed it first. Phone calls that used to be routine suddenly came with urgency. Vendors asking for confirmations that used to be automatic now required approval from Warren personally. Subcontractors began requesting faster payment terms. A few even paused ongoing work until financial clarity was provided. No one used the word crisis yet, but it had already arrived. Warren spent most of that morning in his office with the blinds half closed, reading the operating agreement again and again like repetition might reveal a hidden exit that wasn't there before. Celeste stood in the doorway for a long time without speaking, watching him as if silence itself could be used as leverage. Finally she said, "There has to be a way to delay it." Warren didn't look up. "There isn't. That's impossible," she insisted. People don't just get forced into paying hundreds of thousands of dollars because of one document. He finally looked at her then. Apparently they do. That was the first fracture. Not the financial one. The psychological one. Because Warren Rowan had built his entire identity on the belief that he could control outcomes through force of will. Deals could be renegotiated. People could be persuaded. Problems could be absorbed. But this wasn't a negotiation anymore. It was enforcement. Or borrowed, or sacrificed from somewhere else. And every option had a cost. Warren tried the first solution anyway. He called 3 investors he had worked with over the years. Men who had once praised his reliability, his track record, his iron grip on operational efficiency. 2 didn't answer. 1 called back and asked if the company was in distress. Warren said no. The investor said, "Call me when you're ready to be honest," then hung up. That was when Warren started changing. Not outwardly at first. At home, Celeste noticed it in small things. He stopped finishing meals. Stopped responding immediately when spoken to. Stopped pretending he had certainty when he didn't. Brielle noticed it differently. She stopped talking about the adoption altogether. The framed certificate on the mantel began to feel heavier in the room, not lighter. Like decoration that no longer matched the atmosphere it was supposed to represent. One evening, Celeste tried to soften things. It was processing delay. On Thursday afternoon, Theodore called me. "They've started liquidating short-term assets," he said. I paused. "Which ones?" "2 equipment leases and a partial contract buyout from a development project in Ashbury." I leaned back in my chair. "That's going to slow their entire quarter." "Yes," he said simply. "It will." I didn't feel satisfaction. Not exactly. It was closer to confirmation. Like checking a calculation and finding it correct. "What happens next?" I asked. There was a brief pause. "Next," Theodore said, "they will try to negotiate with you directly." I already knew that part. Because people always tried that part. And he was right. It happened on Friday. Warren showed up at my office building at 4:18 p.m. No appointment. No warning. Just presence. I saw him through the glass doors before the receptionist even had a chance to stop him. He looked different. Not physically, but structurally. "I was your daughter," I said calmly, when it was convenient to acknowledge me. His expression tightened. "That's not fair." I nodded once. "You're right, it isn't." Silence again. He shifted slightly, lowering his voice. "Celeste made mistakes," he said carefully. "I made mistakes. But this level of retaliation is not who you are." I almost smiled at that. Not because it was true, because it was familiar. People always describe you as the version of yourself they need you to remain. The first honest question he had asked me in years. I considered it carefully, because this wasn't about punishment. Not really, it had never started that way. "It's not about what I want," I said. He frowned slightly. "Then what is it about?" I held his gaze. "About what happens when someone writes you out of a structure they depend on and assumes you will stay gone." He didn't respond, because now he understood. Not fully, but enough. I continued. "You have 90 days, I said again. "After that, the court decides what Rowan Custom Homes becomes." His voice dropped. "And if I sell assets too slowly, then you lose control." That was the finality of it. No emotion required, just sequence. Warren stepped back slightly. Not physically collapsing, but mentally recalibrating. For the first time, I saw something in his face I had never seen before. Not anger. Not pride. Not even regret. Uncertainty. "I didn't think you would actually do it," he admitted. I nodded. "I know." Because that was the assumption that had always protected him. That I wouldn't. That I couldn't. That I would absorb it like I always had. But structures don't hold forever under uneven load. They either redistribute stress or they fail. And I was no longer redistributing anything for them. Before leaving, he said one last thing, his voice quieter now. "Is this what you wanted?" I looked at him for a long moment, not as a father. Not as an authority. Just as a variable in a system that had already resolved. No, I said honestly. He frowned slightly. Then what is this? I turned toward the exit. This is what happens when I stop adjusting for everyone else's weight. And I left. That night, I sat alone in my apartment. No television, no music. Just the quiet presence of something fully in motion. My phone buzzed once. Then again, unknown number. Then Warren. Then Celeste. Then Warren again. I didn't answer. The 90-day clock was now visible to everyone involved. And for the first time, the company my father built was no longer operating under assumption. It was operating under constraint, and constraint, unlike loyalty, does not bend for nostalgia. It holds, or it breaks. And Warren Rowan was about to find out which one he had actually built. By the second week, the company stopped feeling like a business and started behaving like a system under controlled failure, not collapse. Not yet. But deformation. The kind engineers recognize before anyone else is willing to name it. Warren tried to stabilize it the only way he knew how, by working more. He arrived earlier than everyone, stayed later than everyone, sat through meetings that used to be delegated, now insisting on handling decisions personally, as if proximity could substitute for liquidity. But control doesn't scale under financial pressure, it fragments. Vendors began tightening terms. One supplier switched Rowan Custom Homes to prepaid materials only after a delayed payment notice. Two subcontractors paused active jobs, citing uncertainty in continuation guarantees. Warren started signing things faster. That was the first visible sign of stress outside the office. Celeste noticed it in how he stopped correcting small mistakes. Brill noticed it in how he stopped reacting to her stories. The house changed shape again. Not physically, structurally. At the dinner table, no one talked about the adoption certificate anymore. It still hung on the mantel. Still framed in gold. Still technically celebrating something that now felt like it belonged to another version of time. But nobody looked at it directly anymore. Because looking at it meant acknowledging what else had been signed into existence. The financial report arrived on Warren's desk the following Monday, printed, bound. That was the first time the word behind became real in the context of Warren Rowan, not emotionally, financially, objectively. Behind, it is a simple word. But in structured systems, it means something very specific: loss of flexibility, loss of options, loss of margin. The space where recovery normally happens, gone. By midweek, Warren attempted something new. He called a private meeting with key employees. Not executives, workers, supervisors, site managers. People who had been with him long enough to trust his voice more than spreadsheets. He stood in the main warehouse and tried to stabilize morale the way he always had, with certainty. "We are not in danger," he told them. But his voice didn't carry the same weight anymore. Because people had already seen the delayed payments, already heard subcontractors complaining, already noticed materials being redirected. Certainty requires consistency. And consistency had already been disrupted. "Why are you telling employees everything is fine when it isn't?" she asked. Warren loosened his tie and avoided her eyes. "Because pen express faster than facts." "That's not the point," she said. "The point is we are running out of options." He finally looked at her. "We are not running out of options." But even he didn't believe it fully anymore. Because options require liquidity. And liquidity was exactly what was being consumed in slow, unavoidable increments. The moment when a strong company is no longer valued for what it is, but for how urgently it needs to exit its position. "What does that mean for my share?" I asked. A pause. "Lower leverage for them, not for you." That was the shift. Warren was no longer negotiating from strength. He was negotiating from constraint. By the end of that week, he finally called me again. Not through Celeste. Not through intermediaries. Direct. I answered this time. Not because I was ready. Because ignoring him no longer changed the outcome. Camille, he said immediately, voice tense but controlled. Dad. A pause. I got an offer, he said. I know. Silence. That surprised him slightly, you know? Theodore informs me of developments. Another pause. Then more carefully, it's not enough. I know that too, he exhaled sharply. Then what do you expect me to do? That question again. But now it carried exhaustion instead of defiance. I walked to my window. Looked outside at traffic moving without awareness of any of this. I don't expect anything, I said honestly. That's not true, he replied quickly. You wouldn't have done this if you didn't expect something. I thought about that for a moment. Then answered, I expected you to read the agreement before signing your life around it. Silence. Then, quieter. You really think this is about a document? I closed my eyes briefly. No, I said. It's about a pattern. He didn't respond immediately. Because patterns are harder to argue with than intentions. I continued. You didn't lose control because of one clause, I said. You lost control because you assumed nothing would ever challenge your authority long enough to matter. A long pause. Then his voice lowered. People make mistakes in families. I nodded even though he couldn't see it. Yes, a beat. And families forgive. That word again. Forgive. I answered carefully. But because the conversation had confirmed something I had already accepted internally, there would be no emotional resolution that fixed structural damage. Only structural consequences that forced recognition. 2 weeks later, Theodore informed me that Warren had secured a short-term loan extension using personal guarantees and partial asset collateral. It bought time. Not stability. Time is often mistaken for recovery. It is not. It is just delayed pressure. And constraint does not respond to leadership, only to capacity. Then came the moment that changed everything again. A creditor issued a formal notice of accelerated payment terms. It was not large enough alone to collapse the company, but it was large enough to tighten everything else. And Warren, for the first time, had to acknowledge something he had avoided since the beginning. He could not negotiate his way out of structure. He could only operate within it. Celeste had stopped asking questions in the way she used to, not because she understood, but because she had run out of ways to make it feel less real. At home, silence became the dominant language. Even Brielle, who had once treated the adoption as a celebration, stopped mentioning it altogether. The framed certificate on the mantel remained exactly where it had been placed that night. But now it felt like something preserved under glass after a storm, not something still alive. On my side, there was no more escalation. No more calls that needed interpretation. Theodore sent updates occasionally, numbers, statuses, progress toward completion, not stories. Just outcomes. Then came the final week. Warren called me one last time on a Tuesday morning. His voice was different now. Not stronger, not weaker, just stripped of everything unnecessary. I can complete it, he said immediately. But I need confirmation on final valuation adjustments. I already knew what that meant. He was not asking for change. He was asking for certainty that the system would behave exactly as defined. Yes, I said. It will execute as written. A pause. Then quieter, so it ends like this. I didn't answer right away. Because that sentence assumes something emotional about closure that didn't exist in the structure we were inside. It ends the way it was defined, I corrected. Silence. He exhaled slowly, then said something I didn't expect anymore. I don't recognize what I build anymore. That line stayed in the air longer than the others, because it wasn't defensive. It wasn't strategic. It was observation. For the first time, Warren Rowan was not trying to control interpretation. He was acknowledging distance. I know, I said finally. Another pause. Will you come by after? He asked quietly. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a reconciliation attempt. It was just a question from someone standing at the end of something too large to reverse. I considered it for a moment. Then answered honestly. I don't think there is anything there for me to return to. He didn't respond immediately. And for once, neither of us filled the silence. Because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to prove, just completion. The final payment was processed on a Friday morning, no announcement. No gathering. No emotional closure moment. Just a confirmation email from Theodore and a formal acknowledgement from Warren's attorney that the buyout had been fully satisfied under Clause 7.3 of the operating agreement. One document ended a structure that had defined decades. And the company remained, but changed, not destroyed, not saved. Rewritten by compliance. That evening, Warren sat alone in his office long after everyone had left. Celeste had gone home earlier. Brielle had stayed with a friend. There was no version of this outcome that felt like victory in the way people expect. Instead, there was quiet. A different kind of balance, not emotional resolution, structural completion. A few days later, Aunt Patrice visited again. We sat at her kitchen table like before. Cinnamon rolls again. Coffee again. The same rhythm that had existed long before any of this had changed shape. She studied me for a long moment and finally said, "You did what Harold would have done." But it no longer felt like a place I belonged to or was excluded from. It just was. A structure continuing its function without me inside it. And that, more than anything, felt like the final form of everything that had happened. Not revenge. Not forgiveness. Not even justice in the emotional sense. Just consequence reaching its natural endpoint. That night, I opened my laptop and went back to work. Abridged design. Load distribution. Stress analysis. Simple, honest systems that behave exactly as defined when force is applied. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was correcting for anyone else's imbalance. I was just building within my own. If there was a lesson buried in all of it, it wasn't loud. It wasn't poetic. It was structural. People assume families are defined by connection. But in practice, they are defined by what they are willing to carry without breaking. And once that limit is crossed, no speech, no certificate, and no memory can restore the original shape. Only time passes. And structure either adapts, or it doesn't, but it never forgets the load it was forced to bear. And neither did I.